so we can practice freeing ourselves from these self-made prisons. And that's why this path is so often called the path of freedom. When Stephen first came to prison, he talked about how the guys could free themselves, and I was a little paranoid, and I thought, ooh, we don't want to talk about being free in prison. But the guys, there was never any question from the guys. They knew we weren't talking about getting out of prison, out of a physical prison. They knew what kind of prison we were talking about. Now, Jan, Steve, and I came up with the topic for this retreat last September in an act of unintentional prescience. But we realized that a lot of difficulties were in our lives, a lot of difficulties were in everybody's lives. Sherry had just been in her horrible, horrible accident. I'd been continuing to live with this highly annoying form of leukemia. Friends and people I cared about were getting sick, all kinds of issues, the issues of life. And like I said, this was before the election. So life can be difficult, and we struggle in the midst of difficulty for many, many reasons, a couple of which I've already touched upon. There's a sense of, check this one out, I think we've all been kind of there, or many of us, a sense of disbelief or lack of acceptance. How could this be happening? The sense of trying to wrest control of what is essentially uncontrollable, to make, as I said, a better past. We sometimes refuse to acknowledge that things are sometimes hard. Oh, I'm fine, everything's fine. We get sick, though. We get old. We die. We lose the people and things that we treasure. Injustice occurs. We see hatred so entwined in our world that we don't even notice, or more accurately, we don't notice unless that hatred is aimed at us. And don't we have a tendency, we're talking about what it's like to be on Facebook these days, don't we have a tendency to complain, whine, and alternate feeling hopeless, rageful, lost, and alone? And all of these are forms of turning away from what is. We forget that difficulty, stress, suffering happens. It's not an aberration. It's the first noble truth. It's not life going not according to plan. It's not that at all. It's life. And this happens. Now, this isn't morbid. It's not fatalistic. It just is. And we can't find ease until we accept and embrace that simple fact. And not just embrace it, because we can embrace it and be pessimistic and fatalistic, but rather embrace it with skill. The simple fact that suffering exists, one might argue, I'm not sure everyone would agree, but one might argue is half of everything the Buddha taught in his 45-year career as a teacher. Because he often said that he only taught two things, how suffering arises and how suffering may cease. In all of these volumes of teaching that he gave us, all vector in, they all point into one of those two things, or both. But if we don't fully embrace and turn towards suffering, stress, unease, dissatisfaction as it arises, how can we alleviate it? It's a little bit like a surgeon who doesn't like blood and who decides to operate with her eyes closed. It's not going to happen. Well, it might happen, but the result might not be satisfactory. As some of you know, I like to discuss the notion that a fair measure of our suffering is based on our evolution. There's a lot of physical danger in the world of our long ago ancestors, and turning away, avoidance, could be life-saving. There's a bunch of dangerous animals over there. Don't go there. But since then, life has gotten less physically dangerous. Certainly there are physical dangers, but not to the extent that there was back in the day, way back in the day. But the dangers have become more subtle, more inner. And we're still reacting the same way so often, don't we? Don't go there. So when difficult things happen, or when we imagine difficult things are going to happen, our mind automatically goes off like a 5-alarm fire. Lights blink, cloud warning, sound. Stories flood in, stories of avoidance, stories of fixing and controlling, of blaming and shaming, stories of a better past, a more certain future. And we get lost in those stories. And even worse, we believe them. We don't see them as just that, stories. And this process, this conditioning, which is a word I like to use, leads us to react automatically and not mindfully to life as it is, which makes it literally impossible to feel ease when things get difficult. And in addition, we develop sometimes complex strategies to avoid the pain we think we may feel. This came up a number of times in discussion groups today. Is it any wonder that addiction is so common? I can't tell you how many times back in the day I used the phrase that maybe some of you also have used: I need something to take the edge off. I need something so that I don't feel. Or another strategy is blaming others for our problems. If only so-and-so had done this or that, this group or that group is dangerous. Or we may withdraw into ourselves and be emotionally distant. Of course, besides being futile, these strategies can't possibly help us. They also lead us to lose our sense of connection. They lead us to think we are somehow separate, freestanding, when the truth is, as the Buddha taught so beautifully, we are all radically interconnected. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. We're all in this together. We all arise from the same sea. This turning away from difficulty that's so deeply ingrained in us is oftentimes called the second arrow. Or put a different way, there's pain and there's suffering. Pain is what happens in life. Suffering is the stuff we heap on top of it. And by stuff, I mean the stories, the projections, the strategies. We were talking in one of the groups this morning, or this afternoon, about how when we, or actually it was, I think during the Q&A, about how when we really pinpoint our awareness and very carefully describe to ourselves pain, the pain changes because the stories fall away and all that's left is the bare sensation of the pain. But this, with the second arrow, we all become reactive. We automatically react. And this is how we turn away. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I was upset that things would never be the same again. I would never again do this or that. And in fact, I did have to give up a lot of things that I had previously loved to do. But I so fought the fact that I didn't want life to be not normal anymore. I wanted things to be normal, even though that ship named normal had sailed away and gone over the horizon, never to return. But nonetheless, I insisted that first year I was going to keep vegetable gardening, for example. I had a big damn garden, bigger than a lot of people's houses in terms of square feet. And I remember dragging my butt back to the house and Mary saying, "You don't have to do this." "Oh, I've got to do this. Here's the vegetables to prove it." And I could barely stand. And my strategies were no more effective in alleviating my suffering than that gentleman's strategy of not accepting that he was in prison. For a while anyway, that was my prison. Until after she said it 100 times, she being my incredible wife, Mary, and it being, we could join the CSA. It got through, and we did. When we deploy these strategies, we're turning away from a number of things, including that most elemental of human emotions, fear. It was clear that that first gentleman in prison I talked about was afraid of what could happen to him given the reality of his situation. And as I mentioned, he was adamant that prison wasn't going to change him. And it was also equally clear that clinging to not facing what was real caused him to be afraid and was a totally failing strategy. Because when we adopt these strategies that can only fail, life can only be unsatisfactory. It can't be any other way. Any other addicts in the room? I mean, that's almost by definition the way things are. If we don't turn toward what is, and to turn toward it with skill. And one of the things we're most afraid of as human beings, probably as animals in general, is the unknown. We rebel against uncertainty. Again, probably evolutionary, and difficult situations are intrinsically uncertain. Almost by definition, difficult situations are uncertain. I arrived here this morning feeling great. By about 10:30, I felt like I was just ready to roll into a ball and just withdraw, cry, blubber, complain, whine. And whining is a failing strategy, I found. What will happen in Washington and around the world to the environment? Who will be arrested and persecuted? Will my disease progress? If so, how quickly? Come to that, even delightful things are uncertain. Look at falling in love. Now there's a sure bet in terms of our happiness, isn't it? What could be more uncertain than a relationship with somebody else? But so many of us, at least at some point in our lives, have craved that, run after it, and it is delightful if we are skillful at it. The reality is, we don't know what's going to happen, do we? Everything changes on a dime, as our dear friend Sherry likes to say. And the stories that we get lost in about why this happened or what could happen down the road only increase our unease. The Buddha had a terrific story that I think many of you have heard, but I'll repeat, about uncertainty. It's about the farmer. One day a farmer went to the field and found that his horse had run away, and all the neighbors said, "Oh, that's bad luck." And the farmer said, "That depends." The next day the horse returned, and the people in his village said, "That's good luck." And the farmer said, "That depends." The next day his son was riding the horse, fell off the horse, broke his leg, and everybody said, "Oh, that's bad luck." And the farmer said, "That depends." The next week, war was declared. All the young men in the village were conscripted. Many of them died, but the man's son couldn't be conscripted because of his broken leg, and the people in the village said, "Oh, that's good luck." And the farmer said, "That depends." We just don't know how things are going to turn out. That's not to say, and I'll talk about this more later, that we're passive people because we have, we can't do anything about it. I am not saying that at all. In fact, quite the opposite. But everything depends. We just can't know. The reality of uncertainty, which for you Buddhists out there is another way of saying impermanence, along with the reality that we are all interconnected, are two of the natural laws that the Buddha taught. Now, natural law these days can make us go, ooh, it's a little creepy. And again, not the best translation. But who can deny the reality of impermanence, really? I mean, boy, if you want to go into denial about that, then you're going to work overtime. And the fact that we're interconnected. We're all ourselves, yet we're also radically interconnected, not just to each other, but to everything. Everything that is, everything that ever was, everything that will be. But we spend so much time denying these truths. And the Buddha had many wonderful teachings that were intended to attack head-on this lack of unease, because we feel ourselves to be solid and separate, and that we don't accept the fact that everything will change. Now, for me, the most important of those, just given my own situation, has been the 5 remembrances, which sound awful grim when you first hear about it. In fact, I was in great health when I first heard about it, and I thought, oh my God, what's with that Buddha guy? And then, as soon as I got sick, they were my lifeline. I'm of a nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I'm of a nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I'm of a nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. I inherit the results of my actions in body, speech, and mind. My actions are the ground on which I stand. Like I said, I hung on to these for a number of reasons, which I'd like to explain. But the real power of them, for me in particular, is that they depersonalize difficulty. look at how much time we spend trying to avoid these truths, including the last one, that our actions are our only possessions. And it's all about us. Oh, I'm sick. Oh, woe is me. I am sick. As opposed to, I am living life. I've got a carbon-based life form, and this stuff happens. And it helps us depersonalize it. When we depersonalize it, we can reconnect again to the truth that we're all connected. We're not here alone. We are not just standalone units. We are part of something much bigger. And again, this isn't an invitation for passivity, as the fifth remembrance so forcefully reminds us. This whole thing is just the most concise, for those of you who are into this, is the most concise description of karma I can imagine. All this stuff will happen because impermanence is the law. But in this moment, I inherit the results of my actions in body, mind, and speech. My actions are the ground on which I stand. So we find that balance, that fulcrum between accepting difficulty and acting wisely. Not just acting, but acting wisely. To live with skill. To live in a way that creates more peace, not less. I have to say, I look at my Facebook feed and I'm not seeing a lot of peace being created by anybody. Or I shouldn't say not by anybody, but there's a lot of stuff out there that's just feeding into festering wounds that already exist. I'd like to talk next about a couple of essential skills that this practice leads us to and teaches us. And the first is not doing. And again, I'm not talking about passivity, but rather I'm talking about not automatically reacting. There's such an automatic conditioned bias, isn't there, on our part, to act, to do something, anything. I've got to do something. And if we just give into that impulse, especially when things are difficult and complex, chances are pretty good that what we do might help us feel better for about 30 seconds. I remember a discussion in prison, I think Stephen was there for this one, where a guy said, hey, you know who I am? Somebody messes with me, I'm gonna mess them up. I'm just gonna mess them up. That's just the way it is. And I said, and how long will you feel good about that? And he stopped and he said, about as long as it will take for them to walk me over to solitary confinement. So at least for the moment, one person got it. So when I talk about not doing, I'm talking about taking in the whole situation, perhaps inwardly asking, what's going on? What's really going on out in the world and below the surface? How am I feeling? What's going on with me? How am I about to react? Is that reaction automatic or mindful? I'm talking about being aware of the consequences of our actions and reactions, including the consequences of our denials, our strategies of turning away. And the amazing thing is that we can do this in the length of time it takes to take a breath. It takes practice to do it. But if we so choose, we can do it in the length of time it takes to take a breath. And when we do that, we see this in prison all the time. I know Stephen was there when one fellow said, I think I've told this story before, but it's a good one. He said he was getting pushed around by a guard. He said he was about to haul off. He said, I took a breath, I remembered to take a breath, and in a flash I saw what my next year would look like. And it wasn't pretty, so I just stepped back. And when we do that, we start to not only stay out of trouble, we start to not do more harm, but we start to gain some insight in wisdom. And also automatically, the more we do this, the more we become truly present to life, into whatever the specific difficulty is that's in front of us, without that difficulty overwhelming us, without guiding us. And what we're really talking about here is the huge discernment that is called right action or wise action. And this, of course, is one of the Noble Eightfold Path. In the Noble Eightfold Path, I've talked a lot about how suffering arises. Well, the Noble Eightfold Path is what the Buddha gave us to alleviate suffering. Right action arises out of another right, or wise. Actually, wise is maybe a better word for it. Well, it arises out of all the other 7 parts of the path, but I'd like to talk just a moment about right understanding, which is another of the Noble Eightfold Path. And right understanding is the embodied understanding, not the intellectual understanding, of these truths that I talked about. Everything that can arise will fade away, impermanence. We are all radically interconnected. And the third one, which I'll talk about briefly after a while, is that when we do this, we live in a better state, a state sometimes referred to as nirvana or nibbana. And when we do this, when we stop and we act wisely, even the most difficult situations become livable. In fact, we get to the point where we can stop labeling situations as good or bad, hard or difficult. We get to the point where this is what is now. You can add if you'd like. I may not like it. It may really, really suck, but this is what is now. And that all begins by not doing, by taking that breath. And another skill that the Buddha taught that I'd like to talk about just briefly is called gladdening. I love Tara Brach's description of gladdening. She says it's a way of remembering what we're forgetting. And specifically, it's a way to remember that while we might get lost in negative self-talk, love also exists. Joy also exists. And just like difficulty, we don't have to summon joy, love, and these allegedly good things. And I say allegedly because when we get into the business of labeling things, we're really locking ourselves into a practice box. We may have preferences, and that's human, but the clinging to those preferences causes us to suffer, causes us to run after pleasure, to avoid difficulty. So we have to be real careful about how we label these things. But we can gladden. It's not so hard. Joy, love, fun is there in equal measure to difficulty. And again, we don't necessarily have to go out and find it. All we have to do is be present. Because when we deploy these strategies of avoidance, we're turning away from everything, including joy. We're just turning away from everything. So we try to manufacture joy. We try to do it through having a lot of possessions or sensual pleasure that we think will make us happy. Without gladdening, we can be lost. We can lose a realistic sense of hope. Now, sometimes we cling to hope, and that's just like clinging to anything else. But here I'm talking about a realistic sense of hope. we can lose the sense that there's good in the world, no matter how much bad we focus on. But if we gladden, we can have this skillful form of hope. It reminds me of a story, and forgive me again for repeating myself. I told this story last year, I think. The story of the cellist of Sarajevo, Verdun Smilovic, who was a cellist for the Sarajevo string quartet, I believe. And you have to understand that in Sarajevo, from I think it was 93 to 95, every single day for 3 years, mortars and bullets rained down on the city, which is in the bottom of a bowl, from the hills around it. Need a loaf of bread, you put your life in your hands to go out and get it. It was a horrible situation, but Verdun Smilovic would put on his tuxedo and, to his own great peril, would go out, sometimes sitting in the ruins of bombed out buildings, and play beautiful music. Because he knew, he said, that music could bring joy. And joy was needed, dramatically needed, not just in a horrible situation like that, but for all of us at all times. So we can practice gladdening. We can stop, take a breath when we're with somebody we love and feel gratitude. We can walk in nature. We can listen to beautiful music and stop and really listen to it, to be with it. And when we practice in this way of gladdening, we see life so much more clearly and accurately because, as I said, joy, love, it's all part of the deal, as well as difficulty and suffering. And finally, and I'll just talk just a moment about this, another skill we learn is that we start hearing the stories that go through our mind for just what they are. They're just stories. If so-and-so had only done this or hadn't done that, and oh, I'm an idiot because of this, blah, blah, blah. We tell ourselves these stories all the time. I came across a wonderful quote from a writer named Janet Malcolm who said, "We go through life mishearing and misseeing and misunderstanding so that the stories we tell ourselves will add up." Isn't that the way? And mindfulness is a way of seeing these stories for what they are. Strategies to avoid life as it is. This path is called the path of freedom for a reason. That young lifer in prison knew he could be free, even incarcerated for the rest of his life, while the other prison who refused to turn toward his pain would be in prison even if he were released. And that, as I said, is our choice. We can remain in our self-made prisons, or with the aid of this practice, we can get out. And when we practice diligently, it's not a straight line, but it's an upward trend. It's a trend line that goes up. And when we practice diligently, a number of important things happen. First, and I want to explain this, fear ends. Now, fear doesn't really end, but our relationship to fear changes dramatically. Fear isn't running the show or the country, but rather we just turn toward what is, and we're present to it. Now, from the outside, it looks like courage, but it really is just presence. There's nothing special about it when you do it, and you're just fully present. There's nothing special about it at all, unless you're looking at it from the outside, and they'll say, "Oh, that's so courageous." Bah, bah. It's not really courageous, or maybe it is courageous. I don't know, because we're breaking deeply ingrained habits of mind. And that's not easy. And another thing that happens is that we start to understand that we simply cannot be selective about what we embrace and turn toward, as that one prisoner was trying to do. We practice turning toward it all. We embrace the whole enchilada. Don't get me started about dinner tonight, but we embrace it all. We embrace it all. Our beautiful grandchildren and the deep loss of loved ones and the loss of our abilities, the loss of our health, cancer, the Cubs winning the World Series, filling the gas tank, going to the bathroom, doing the laundry. It's all equally deserving of our full mindful presence. Jan talked earlier, and Stephen, about at retreat we want to practice continuity of presence, of mindfulness. But it's not just in retreat, in life. It's all worth turning to. And when we live in this way, we glimpse, literally experience, if only briefly, nirvana. Nirvana is not heaven. It's not a place where we do something for a while and we act in a certain way and then we graduate. We're out of here. Rather, it's a place in which our conditioning, our fears, our reactivities don't control us. They don't drive the car. We drive the car. And we see all of these things for what they are. That's why Thich Nhat Hanh tells us over and over and over again that nirvana is here and now. I'm a fan, it's a little controversial, but I'm a fan of a Buddhist teacher named Stephen Batchelor. And I was just reading in his latest book, The Future of Buddhism, where he notes that the Buddha didn't talk about nirvana as something he graduated to. But rather, Batchelor says, Gautama speaks of nirvana as a radical shift in perspective, rather than an arrival at a set of answers to existential questions. In other words, we live nirvana. We don't earn it and get a diploma. It isn't memorizing the Dharma, it's embodying the Dharma. And we can only do that when we practice. And it isn't easy. This is not easy. In fact, the Buddha described his own awakening, and I'm going to butcher this Pali, Patisotagami, which literally translates as going against the stream. This isn't just some practitioner from, the last 2,600 years. This is the Buddha who described his own enlightenment, the process of his own enlightenment, is going against the stream of his deeply held automatic stories and conditions, all these things that guide us all. And it's a stream with a very strong current. But we can swim against this current by practicing. This process, this effort of liberation is utterly mundane. It's as simple as taking a breath and then another breath and another one in awareness. And this practice, this path of liberation is utterly spiritual. It connects us through space and time directly, not theoretically, but directly to all that is, all that ever was. Back in the 80s, we used to like to say, well, we're all made of the stars, because there was the cosmic fireball 14 billion years ago, where all the matter that was ever created was created in that flash. And it's spreading through the universe, forming and reforming, and that includes us. And it's very true. It was repeated so often that it got a little stale maybe, but it's totally true. And that's what this practice takes us to, is this radical interweaving of everything. And the effect of this practice from moment to moment is to connect us, not separate us. Any practice that separates us is not this practice. It connects us, because nothing, not joy, not difficulty, not pain, not suffering, not our very selves, nothing arises out of nothing. And that is such a powerful understanding. Such a powerful understanding. And in our liberation, when we taste it, in our taste of nirvana, we understand that difficulty isn't a failure on our part or somebody else's failure, but it's the way things sometimes are. It's life living through us. When we're sick, that's life living through us. When we breathe, the breath doesn't need our permission. It just happens. And so it is with all of these things in life. The things we identify and label as good, and the things we identify and label is bad. It is life living through us. And we learn that we're all in this together. We're not struggling alone. And I want to emphasize the word all in this time. We're all in this together. As hard as it might be sometimes to be with others who we may disagree with, we're in it with them too. And notice the language. We're in it with them. That means me and you, us and them. And that is not any way to alleviate suffering in the long run, even as we act, and sometimes act forcefully. So when we practice, we can live fully. We can live fully in a way that those who don't have this practice or a practice like this, have a hard time imagining. That full embodied presence in this moment, this lack of reactivity, this lack of habits of mind controlling the action. We're alive. It's mundane. It's deeply spiritual. And there's no difference between the two. None whatsoever. I say this a lot, and I'm sorry again to repeat myself. But this life happening stuff, it's liberating to really understand that. And it's one of the gifts of having a serious health issue. This isn't about me. This isn't about me at all. And since this has happened, it's been awfully damn difficult at times, no question about it. It's been awfully damn difficult on my incredible partner, Mary, who's supported me every step of the way. But I can tell you, in the last 3 years, these have been the happiest years of my life. Because the circumstance made me choose whether I had to be miserable or present. And it sounds simple, and in a way it's very simple. And usually I make that choice consciously, although there are times, including a time earlier today, where I thought it would be insane to be in my body. But here I am. Who knows? Who knows? We can't know. So we liberate ourselves from trying to control, to create a better past, to create a future when we don't have control over this or that in the future. We liberate ourselves from all these habits, reactions, stories, all this conditioning. And we can live fully together. And the way to this liberation literally can begin with your next breath. This isn't anything special. It's not, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, it's not a matter of faith. It's a matter of practice. So let's practice together. That's our way out. Thank you. So let's just sit for just a minute.